Tonight it is my privilege to introduce Michael Mahalchick. Michael was born and raised in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, and received his BFA from Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia and his MFA from California Institute of the Arts. He currently lives and works in Brooklyn and is represented by Canada, where he has had 6 solo shows over the last 14 years. He has performed and shown at David Zwirner Gallery, the Whitney, the Tate, the New Museum, the Chelsea Hotel, Sculpture Center, the Kitchen, Frankfurter Kunstverein, Judson Church, PS1, and the Knitting Factory. Michael dances in black boxes and performs in white cubes, where he also installs his assemblage and collages. The first time I heard the name Michael Mahalchick was in the fall of 2002 from a teacher of mine at CalArts, Leslie Dick. She had taught Michael as well in the mid-90s. He was the first artist recommended to me in a studio visit that wasn't well known or established. He was more of a contemporary than an art historical figure or an art world star. She suggested him because I was making objects and activating them through actions, and I tended to use what was around. I also think it was because I was a male that knew how to sew, and I was dealing with clothing in the handmade. But in 2002, when I looked up Michael, there were no catalogs in the CalArts library, so I looked online, and there wasn't much about him. He graduated a year after Laura Owens, who was having her first survey at the LA MoCA that year, 8 years out of CalArts. Meanwhile, Michael seemed like a ghost. Then about a year later, I came across his name in Freeze, a review of a 2-person show with Jocelyn Shipley in 2003 at Canada. It described his love bears made from clothes and an experimental performance by their musical duo, Turducken. Then an art form review in 2004, more soft characters made of scavenged fabric and wrapping. This was kind of the way you experienced art before social media, was kind of through reviews if you couldn't actually see the shows physically. Anyways, Michael was kind of a press darling. Probably since most of his shows kind of were conceived around a 30-day endurance performance, kind of total installation. In most of these reviews, Michael is compared to big-name artists, mostly sculptors, like Mike Kelly and Paul McCarthy, due to their objections, stuffed animals, pop, craft, horror, performance. Robert Rauschenberg, art and life, plus assemblage, and Rauschenberg liked dance too. Bruce Conner, dirtier and messier assemblage meets funk. Joseph Beuys, social sculpture, shamanism, and lard. Gordon Clark, garbage, cutting, and creation through destruction. And Klaus Oldenburg, soft sculpture, pop, and latex. It is funny that no one mentions more obviously aligned artists like Jack Smith, Ed Kienholz, Lucas Samaras, Charlemagne Palestine, Tony Conrad, Penny Arcade, Joseph Cornell, Janice B. Porridge, Gelatin, Vaginal Davis, and Nayland Blake, the artists who deal with sound, music, performance, costume, camp, psychedelia, and fetish. In a way, the freak and geek artists. Of course, Michael Jackson's Thriller and Queen's and David Bowie's Under Pressure music videos, which came out when Michael was about 10 years old, also seem appropriate. The monster, the grotesque, the mask, the made up, the glammed out, the flesh and blood. Mahalchick is the real deal, old school, off Broadway, more occult than cult, and an anti-social media star and a legendary lover of the popular and the arcane. Let's welcome Michael.
Hi, thanks, Tyler. That was a great introduction. So I guess what I'm going to start with tonight, I'm going to talk about 3 projects only, and I'm not going to focus very much on individual pieces, but my work doesn't fit in a very simply into like a traditional idea of sculpture or collage or anything like that. My exhibitions are sort of pieces in themselves, so I would say they're kind of a form of installation. They'll often have element of performance to them. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a show that I did in March of 2012 at the Canada Gallery. And rather than go right to images, I'm going to read this press release for this show. The interesting thing about this press release is that it was written by a friend of mine named Marcos Rosales. And the structure of the press release actually mirrors my process in some way, so I think it's pertinent and interesting. What had happened is that Marcos came to my studio, and I've known Marcos for 20 years, so he knows my work pretty well. You know, we went to grad school together. And I asked him to do the press release, and what he did was come to my studio, and I showed him some works and talked about my ideas about the performance that was going to happen and what ideas about what the work is about. And what he did was he made a list of the different artists that my work and what I was saying about my work triggered in his mind. And then he went home and went through different articles and books and their own press releases and sort of cobbled together this sort of Frankenstein press release from this other material. So I'm just going to read it to you, and then I'll show you an image, because what he then did when he gave me the press release was he requested that when the gallery prints it, that they would print it in the way that he sent it, which was with many different fonts. And so each font represents sort of the appropriated passages, and then there's a separate font for the parts that he kind of added in to connect these passages. So I'm just going to read this now, mainly because it's my favorite press release, and I think it explains my work in a way that it feels very satisfying to me. All right. Michael Mahalchick presents his third solo exhibition at Canada Gallery entitled It. In this exhibition, Mahalchick presents sculptural arrangements, fashioning pieces from cheap and discarded items such as pillows, porn magazines, and clothing. He works at making his pieces awkward and unpleasant to the eye, wanting to create anti-gestures. He is uncomfortable with the possibility of his works being appreciated for sheer aesthetics. This unpleasantness of form in his art is undeniably a component of its content. In this sense, elegance or refinement would defeat his purpose. He does not intend his forms to be finished, graceful, or polished. His subjects are the cast-offs of society, the throwaways, and are treated in his works as they are treated by society. He justifies his use of such non-art materials as a marked reaction against what he sees as clean art by pointing to the precedents of Dada, outsider art, and art de pauvre. The entire installation seems provisional or still under construction, abandoned or frozen. The absence of the body is felt amidst this detritus. Indeed, although everything included is in some way man-made, the lack of a living presence speaks to our dissociation from what we have produced. The inanimate world brims with longing and memory, waiting to be coaxed forward, and he has made a regular habit of doing so. This exhibition is a walk-in manifesto, a book of the dead about the psychic place where mysticism, modernism, mayhem, and terror collapse into one another. Many will find this show revolting, not because it's bad or resembles a parade float from perdition or weakens upon repeated visits, but because of a puerile addiction to the macabre and the scatological. Mahalchick wants to unleash the explosive power of art, remove boundaries, and create a constellation of meanings. His art reveals the diverse emotions, from treasured to unwanted, inherent in everyday objects, serving as a link to personal connections and the ambiguity of language. His work helps to develop a viewer's awareness and understanding of social themes through wordplay as well as juxtapositions of technology and other found objects. No object is out of place, and each contributes to the greater whole. The narrative built from each element's associations is disjointed and open-ended. What we create reflects our place in relation to everything that is important to us. The debris we leave behind is an extension of ourselves in relation to our environments. Environments that are man-made are merely collections of objects. These objects are made by us. They represent our collective selves. Mahalchick crams his works with the material clutter of life. He saturates his works with objects that are easily identifiable with certain aspects of society. While not strictly junk, these objects have lives of their own outside of the tableau of which they are made a part. Unlike many artists who are working with found objects, Mahalchick does not attempt to give these objects a high art identity. They continue in his works to function in the manner that they were originally intended. The use of found objects multiplies the sense of neglect that is common to all his works. The incorporation of things that were once useful to society emphasizes the uselessness of the cast-offs of humanity. Mahalchick avoids altering his finds from their original state, so his sculptures are strikingly simple. Harvesting, fusing, and reconstructing references from myriad sources, he takes an anything-goes approach to the materials he uses to convey multiple meanings in unexpected ways. It is these kinds of assemblages that explore the tension between openness and an age of crumbling symbols and broken icons. These sculptural arrangements display an additive quality that gives them a distinct informality, conversational, provisional, at times even corroded and corrupted. They are unheroic and manifestly unmonumental. Consciously, they fall desperately short of the iconic, becoming vestiges, posed as emblems for that which cannot be conveyed. The simplicity, a gaping magnitude of impotency, dull tones, vague, nondescript scenes, stripped of emotional propaganda. In Mahalchick's works, the faded language of nostalgia is strangely empty, void of sympathy or moral, a scene twice removed, making it impulsively human. Without context of history or source, the viewer is left to engage with the sculpture on a purely instinctive level, familiar, distant, like haunting memories. Ritual and tradition play a large part in his work, drawing on the solace in repetition, the blind faith of unquestioned custom. The pieces in this exhibition serve less as a reminder of a vibrant life than a lingering forbearance of death. Ghost, faded and shrinking, sinister and anonymous, lonely relics without sentiment or intimacy. Okay, so that's an image of the press release. If you notice, there's different fonts. And so you know which parts were sort of cribbed from someplace else. He actually didn't tell me what artist he looked at, so I still don't know to this day. So what we're listening to now is a song by Dionne Warwick called I'll Never Love This Way Again. So let me go to this next image. So this image is from the show It. So It consisted of 2 parts, kind of. And the first part was a performance and then the exhibition. So the night before the exhibition opened, I did a performance which involved me kind of creating the show, assembling the show live for the people that came. And so the way the performance happened is that people entered the space and this is what they saw, sort of a collection of objects strewn about the space, sort of evenly. And this song was playing. And there was a coffee pot near the front, and people could have a cup of coffee, but they got the smell of coffee very strong when they came into the space. And you'll see as I describe this, there's a lot of smell elements in the performance. So they entered the space, they smelled the coffee, they had a cup of coffee if they wanted it. And this was the front room. And then this was the second room, which had a table, which was sort of like the lunch area for the people that worked at the gallery, and also a place to look at work that wasn't in the show, but I incorporated it into my show. And then you went into the back room, and these are sort of images of the materials strewn about. So people had the coffee, and they kind of walked around. And this song played, and the reason I chose this song is that this song has a sort of connection to ideas about thinking about the past and the future at the same time. Very ideas about memories and hopes, and it has a sort of sad quality, which that I found very appealing. The second song that plays while people are walking around is "Macho Man" by the Village People, and that song is sort of very opposite of this song, which it's a song really about the body and the hedonism of the body. So these are sort of the 2 things at odds right at the beginning of the piece. So this song ended, Macho Man comes on, and the next song that comes on, which is very incongruous, is Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Now remember, this is March, so it really seemed very out of place, and sort of like the idea of that was to sort of transport you to like a different sense of time. And so as Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer played, I wandered around the space, and collected different bits and pieces and brought them back into this room and constructed the first object or sculpture of the show, which, while the song played, which was this piece, which is called Rudolph. And this piece is basically a bowl, a bow tie, a butcher block knife holder, a red rubber bracelet, a bead, a piece of glass with a kind of a Velcro sticker on it, and a part of a planter. And so I formed this sort of sculpture. So this was sort of the beginning of the performance happening in an active way. So the next thing that happens after I finish constructing this first sculpture is all the lights go out. So the gallery becomes very pitch black, and everyone sort of has to stay in their space because of all the materials strewn about the floor. If they moved around, they would trip or maybe break something, so it sort of kind of froze everybody in place. And as it went pitch black, you couldn't see anything, but all you could hear was this. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me you'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. The other right there, as I see you drift on you. So this is me singing live. It was an attempt to sound sort of like a distressed cassette being eaten by the cassette recorder a little bit. Now, so the other thing that was happening during this singing was that I had given oranges to some of the audience that were sort of plants. And what they did while I was singing this was started to peel the oranges. So that was the sort of second smell element that kind of came into the performance. And suddenly, if you're peeling an orange, the smell is pretty strong. Everyone could smell it pretty far around. So you would be hearing this and you'd be smelling oranges. And you could hear people dropping the orange peels on the floor at the time. So, anyway, I finished doing that singing, and there's a few candles. So right now it's pitch black in the gallery, and what I do is I light some candles, and then I use those candles to maneuver around the gallery and start to build the second sculpture. And so that second sculpture gets built. It has a light element which provides a little more light to the exhibition, or to the space. It's not quite an exhibition yet. And so I'm going to show you kind of 4 bits and pieces of this performance. The performance itself was about 2 hours long, so it was a pretty long, evolved thing. And so here is one part. So with this part of the performance, I made a sculpture that had a strobe light and also had this sort of old analog style telephone. And I have a conversation with somebody on the other side of the telephone, but I only use a limited amount of phrases for my conversation, which is yes, no, maybe, and I'll tell him. And so this conversation, not sure exactly how long it goes on, but you don't know what's going on the other side of the line, but the only information you're getting is these, 4 small phrases. No. Maybe. No. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes. So then another section. Yes. involves me, and what I'm holding there is a stick of patchouli incense, so that's another smell element. Now, the reason I use these smells is that they're meant to sort of be triggers for memory. So I tried to choose kind of smells that people kind of recognize or have some kind of emotional resonance maybe with people. And what I'm doing here is just making sort of these tonal things that are sort of like tonal notes that are sort of meant to seem like they're like a channeling of some kind of information from the other side. There's some other things that happened before this, but I'm just putting the highlights really. And then in this other part, which is kind of the part everyone remembers probably the most, I'm wearing a stocking over my head, wearing a leather glove, and carrying a knife. And I created this sort of sculpture in the corner that has a blue light, and is sort of like a station. The sculpture is called Milking Station. And what I'm doing right there is I'm stapling bacon to the wall. And so eventually what happens with this bacon is that on the sculpture there's a George Foreman grill, and I basically fry up a lot of the bacon, and so the room really got overwhelmingly bacon-y, to the point that some people were very nauseated because it was rather intense, I suppose. Oh, and those chimes you'll hear isn't part of another sculpture, but and then oh yeah, I run out of staples, actually, because I didn't check it before the performance. So eventually, I just end up kind of, you'll see, smoothing the bacon to the wall. It sort of sticks by itself. And then for this last section, I'm sitting in a wheelchair, and I'm playing the song "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry." And so the wheelchair part was towards the end of the performance, so the space was decluttered, kind of very much. So the last kind of pieces that I kind of put together this is one of the last pieces that I made. I traveled around the gallery in the wheelchair collecting the pieces. And so you can't tell because I had to shoot the video. The video had to be recorded in night vision, but you can't tell that the blanket that's sitting on me there is a High School Musical blanket with Zac Efron kind of prime. And I use that in the performance to place over myself, so I become kind of Zac Efron at the end of the performance. And I walk out of the exhibition and turn on all the lights, and what you end up with, well, got ahead of myself. So this is just a list of different kind of things that happened in the performance. Of course, Macho Man and Patchouli. And then I played a hypnosis video from YouTube about gaining supreme self-confidence. At a point, I drenched myself in this cologne by Issey Miyake called L'Odyssée, which is a pun, which I thought was nice, of the French for the Odyssey. And then there was other sound elements, which was I played Motley Crue's Shadow the Devil record, and then I handed out joints that people lit up, so then the room kind of smelled of marijuana very strongly. And I had recordings from I was at CalArts at the time of the 1994 earthquake, and after the earthquake I recorded the radio, basically, which is emergency radio, telling where you go if you need help, or what you shouldn't do, and if there's a curfew, so it's very dark. And then, of course, Zac Efron was that blanket at the end, who I kind of became Zac Efron, kind of like a ghost. It was this blanket I put over, and the face was like my size, so I could put the face over my face and walk around, and it's sort of like I'm Zac Efron. So after I leave the room as this sort of Zac Efron ghost, I turn on the lights, and this is basically what the exhibition looks like at the end. It looks like your standard, art exhibition. So this is the front room, and Then this is the kind of middle room with the table. And then this is what the back room ends up looking like. And so now I'm just going to kind of quickly go through all the pieces that were in the show and maybe give a tiny description, but it'll be pretty fast. If you have a question during this part, just feel free to shout it out or not. This piece is called Portal, and this square of canvas with white, it was on a piece of foam underneath it. That was the structure behind it, and I took a pin and placed it in, and this sort of like map board. This piece is called Early Childhood Development. It's actually the only framed piece in the show. It's the first piece you see when you come into the show, and I chose to put this one framed piece in to sort of set the theme of understanding the work as fine art. This is called Your Wind Song Stays on My Mind, and this piece is with the chimes that you heard in the video, and that's an arm of wheelchair, a tiny pair of handcuffs, and a blade from a juicer. This piece is called Unshaven Leg, which is plastic mirrors and canvas on masonite, and you'll see these plastic mirrors come up. I end up using them a lot, starting with this show, but then the last thing I'll talk about, which is my last show at Canada, you'll see them in that piece, in that show too. This piece is called Trinitron, and the black parts of this piece are a TV wall mount, not for a flat screen. This is before flat screen, so it's sort of for like in the hospital they used to have like a small TV on a mount, and so all the black parts are that. The grid parts are cardboard leftovers from game pieces. This piece is called Basketball Wife, which is the rug and a stocking stuffed with like a foil and fabric to form this sort of bottle-like form. This piece is called Copacabana. The main structure underneath is a found canvas again. I didn't do that, and basically I strung antique silver thread across as a sort of like it's a little bit like a sad Agnes Martin. This piece is called Palabra Bruja, and that roughly translates to Bubble Witch. I got the title when I was in Uruguay, and I went past this laundromat, and it said that on the window, and I was like, oh, what's that? And I thought it was a nice name. So what this piece has, 3 candles in it. Now, so this piece, every day the candles were, new candles were put on, so over the length of the exhibition, the wax really starts to build up. And there's a sort of a little statue of a gold lion and some of the orange peels and a string of beads, heart-shaped beads. And it's around this frame that has gold threads wrapped around it that kind of surround this water pipe. And it sits on a square of very realistic fake grass. This piece is called The Bachelor, which is a 3-part screen with a cushion, a keyboard, there's an antenna, there's the knife that I used in the performances embedded into it, and this gold chain, and there's a found photograph of a man sitting in the cockpit of an airplane. This piece is another found canvas piece that the piece is called Put Some Lipstick on It, which is literally the red and pink parts are just lipstick that I added to the canvas. This piece is called Mystical Washington, and you'll see that there's the mirrors and there's a King Tut mask and some cushioning. Piece is called Mirror. The size of this piece is about the size of your bathroom mirror. It's just mylar and 2 dowels. This piece is called Queen. It's the wheelchair, and there's a pillow that's covered in latex, so it's sort of this rubber pillow, and a 5-pound medicine ball sits on it. And then there's a guitar that's covered in panties, and a small button from the band Queen, and the top part of it is part of a rocking chair. That was actually an old piece by Zyler Jane. This piece is called Rose's Turn, and the ground was found. It was a piece of display cardboard that somebody had put this blue on, and the rose petals are from a boutonniere from my senior prom. And so I just took the petals and put them on there. This piece is called The Bride. This is the piece with the strobe light that you saw earlier with the phone. And it's some speakers, a soup, a wire basket, a porcelain flower, some DVD cases, old VHS camcorder, and a couple bottles of poppers, and this bit of crinoline. This piece called The Pirate. It's a speaker cover and a couple pair of stockings and some packaging for a pirate costume. This piece is called Deli Boy. It's 2 found canvases, and if you see the canvas on the left with the bagel and the headband, that's still wrapped in plastic, actually. It was never used. It was but it was just all dirty and grungy like that. On the other side is an old pillow that's sort of kind of where it kind of, all the feathers kind of sat towards the bottom, and it kind of looked like sort of like a pot belly a little bit. And so like right where the belly button is sort of this shell bead. This is the milking station, and this is where the bacon was cooked. And what it is 2 piles of porn magazines with a glass tabletop, the George Foreman grill, a cell phone. Next to it are some empty milk bottles that after I would cook the bacon, I would put the bacon inside the milk bottles, and then there's a bucket to collect the bacon fat that dripped out. It's a Christmas bucket with puppies on it. This piece is called It. It's 2 ceiling tiles. They're kind of installed in the corner of the room so you can see both, sort of as a diptych. And it's these stained ceiling tiles with a sweat sock, a Chinese finger trap, novelty tie, and then a photograph of like 2 pink flamingos and a bird bath with a ball in it that I took when I was in a high school photography class, actually. This piece called Youthquake, which is has the guitar, but it also has this sort of a stereo element. And so during the exhibition, the stereo part would play out of these 2 Budweiser speakers. It would play Motley Crue Shout at the Devil, or the Earthquake, the 94 Earthquake kind of recordings from the radio. So that was always running in the gallery. Oh, then the coffee maker was always running in the gallery too, so when you came into the show, you always could have a cup of coffee. A piece called Main Drain. It's just some netting and some very patriotic ribbon, and this sort of little sign that says Main Drain. This piece is called Guapo, and it's a aluminum frame held with a red push pin and a mirror that has toothpaste remnants from brushing your teeth, and this little sticker of the letter I and this bit of towel. This piece is called Eyebrow, which is part of a chair, a broken frying pan, and a stereo speaker front. This is called Creationist Museum, and so it's a series of objects that they're held on there with straight pins. So none of this stuff is very, it's not glued down or anything like that. It's very kind of temporarily attached. But you have a test tube, and then this sort of like bit of corrugated plastic with a bunch of nail polish on it, and well, you can see. This piece called Puddin' Face, which is just a baking pan with a bowl and 2 beads and remnants of some acrylic paint. This piece called Vestment, and it's just fabric which I sewed on these kind of blue parts, which you saw in the sort of tonal performance part. It became this sort of robe. All right, so that was it. What I'm going to talk about now is another project that I did at the New Britain Museum of American Art in New Britain, Connecticut. And this show was called Here Today, Gone Tomorrow. And the way this show worked is they asked me to do a show, and what I asked of them was for them to reach out to the community, the New Britain community, the community around the museum, the people who came to the museum, their members and stuff like that, if they would donate any materials for me to make the show. And so I asked for anything that might have, you might give to a garage sale or to the Goodwill, or things that you were willing to donate that you weren't necessarily going to bring back or get back. So they would be donated to the show, and I would make a show out of this artwork. And so this Nixon Resigns paper is one of the things I got. I mean, there was amazing things that people sent, sort of like, leg braces from polio, for people that were stricken with polio. There was newspapers about the first moon landing. There was a lot of really bad art and a lot of bad frames. And so the idea was sort of like you would come to the museum, the community would come to the museum and kind of have certain, to see themselves literally in the exhibition. And so I got, some stuff was pure garbage, some stuff was sort of interesting materials. But anyway, this is sort of what the show looked like when I was done. Now, you see these paintings that are hanging in there. Those paintings weren't part of the museum in general. The interesting thing about these paintings is that the New Britain Museum of Industry was like, oh, we want to take part. We'd love if you'd come by our museum and pick something out to use within your show, as long as you don't alter it in any way, which isn't a problem because I generally don't alter things at all. And you could borrow it and then use it. So I went to the New Britain Industrial Museum, and it was literally in an office building on the second floor. And I went up there, and it literally just looked like a junk shop. It was insanely filled, overly filled, not really an exhibition. It was more like a hoarder's house. And so within there, they had some interesting things. They had like a Stanley steamer, which was an early car, which is sort of made, that was a steam-driven car, made by this man, Mr. Stanley, who eventually became Stanley Tools. So they had a lot of tools. They had a huge collection of thermoses. So who knew in New Britain, Connecticut was where the original thermos was designed. They also had a lot of ball bearings, because the ball bearings for the lunar lander were all made in New Britain, Connecticut. So it was interesting because people gave me some donated newspapers from the lunar landing, which was, I didn't put it two and two together, but I was like, oh, that makes sense that they would hold on to that bit of history. But also amongst all this other, there was toasters, there was all kinds of stuff that seemed like a junk store, it really did. But the other thing that was hanging were all these sort of like late 18th, early 19th century portraits, which seemed very incongruous to the rest of the museum. And they were hung kind of haphazardly everywhere, with no rhyme or reason. And I was like, oh, I'm curious about these portraits. And she was like, oh, well, those are portraits of the titans of industry in the early history of New Britain. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So after I had the tour, she asked me, like, well, what would you like to use for your exhibition? And I was like, honestly, I would like to bring all the paintings to the museum. And she was a little surprised, because I think she had some other ideas in mind. But the funny part about the paintings is that they were deaccessioned by the museum and donated to the Museum of Industry, because they weren't notable enough as artwork for the museum to maintain them in their collection, and they thought the museum of the Industrial Museum would enjoy having them. And so what's interesting is that actually in the New Britain Museum was in a house. It was sort of a house in New Britain, and that they had developed it, and they got a normal museum space, and the house became offices for the museum. So these paintings were originally housed in the old New Britain Museum, which was this house. So I thought it was nice that I was able to bring them back and show them in the museum proper, I suppose. Now, if you notice that the paintings are kind of hung in a funny way, and what my decision was to do was to bring back the paintings, but not hang them in your average, the classic way of hanging such paintings at a particular height. I had them hang the paintings so that the heads were kind of at the height of what a person would be. so that they became sort of like viewers or another part of the community from the past that were gone, but now they're back and they're sort of they're relatable in a direct way to the human body, I guess. And so when you looked at the paintings, they were sort of like you could see them as members of the community. So these are just a couple more images. And so these are all temporary kind of sculptures that after the exhibition was over, I'm pretty sure they just threw them away. I don't know if they offered people to come back and get them, but I think they just discarded them, so they're long gone. They're temporary works, really. The work was the exhibition. This is nice. This NB Art Museum, somebody donated this sign, which is funny because I put it in the gallery itself, pointing out of the galleries where my exhibition was, sort of like the museum is out there. Oh, and see this thing in the front, those were the leg braces, which were a really creepy and amazing thing that somebody donated. And see, so these are some of the paintings hung weirdly low. I got a lot of frames. So, okay, there was also a performance element to the show. And the way I handled the performance was that I gave sort of a artist tour of the collection at the Newburgh Museum. So it started in the lobby where there's this sort of very realistic sculpture of a guard. And the way the performance started is I sort of came out and I talked about I wanted to introduce a very important member of the museum. And as I was standing next to this sort of very realistic sculpture, one thing I'm forgetting is that prior to people coming to me for that, I was standing next to the sculpture very, very still, as if I was a sculpture also. But so I do an introduction and I bring people in, and the first room or hallway is their new additions to the museum. And so this is the first painting I stop at for my little tour. And it's a painting by Mather Brown of someone named Richard Arkwright. Now, I did a little bit background history of Richard Arkwright, and he started out as a wig maker who kind of earned his money by creating a waterproof wig dye, because I guess it was a problem that when it would rain, people's wigs would drip colors down their face. And then he eventually took that money and went into making cloth and created a machine in order to spin yarn in a huge amounts. So what I did is I created sort of a yarn myself about his story, kind of a fake story about how a mysterious figure came and offered to teach him how to make a wig dye that didn't run, but there was sort of he had to, in order for the mysterious figure to give him the secret to making a waterproof wig dye, that this spirit would be able to use his image to become a kind of a symbol of the common man. Now, so this story is a very kind of this elaborate story, but what had drawn me to this was that when I was preparing for the show, in the basement of the museum, there was 2 bathrooms that were, I guess, were never designated as male or female, but the museum staff decided they needed to designate them, and they used this a photocopy of this painting, a color photocopy painting, as the indicator of the men's room, which is sort of a little bit at odds with sort of what this picture represents. So it's sort of about like, here's engaging these ideas about meaning and representation of like what this image means in one space versus kind of behind the scenes in the museum. So the second room that I went into was a room of like 18th, 19th century portraits, and I decided I was going to write about this pair of portraits. Now, the interesting thing is, after I decided to use these portraits, and I came back to the museum, and the portraits were gone, and they were replaced with a sign saying, removed for restoration, which sort of put a little kink in my plans, but kind of worked out really great, being that the title of the show was Here Today, Gone Tomorrow. So what I did is wrote this text and read this in front of the blank spaces on the walls. A few weeks ago, while visiting the museum, I had the distinct pleasure of meeting a lovely couple in this very room who were introduced to me by Mr. William Jennings. William Jennings is the painter who made these paintings. They were successful farmers from the local area by the name of Mr. and Mrs. William Earl. They were not very talkative, but Mr. Jennings was helpful in providing me with some information about them. Both of the Earls were of a small, wiry build with, sorry, I turned this side up. With Mrs. Earl seeming almost frail, even in the presence of her slight husband. I would estimate their ages to be somewhere in the range of the mid to late 40s. Mr. Earl had a high forehead, accentuated by his receding hairline, which gave his head an exaggerated egg shape that was quite distinctive. Although his hair loss showed his age, what hair he did have left was a youthful brown, with just the barest hint of gray, and spilled well beyond the collar of his black double-breasted jacket. Combined with his long sideburns, it gave him the look, perhaps, of an aging rock and roller. His eyebrows, while quite full, were not what I would describe as bushy, and possessed an arch that made his slate blue eyes seem alert and lively. His eyes had a slight downward turn that suggested a gentle, thoughtful personality that strangely reminded me of Matthew Broderick. His right ear, while perfectly proportioned for his head, seemed oddly flat, and his lips possessed a pillowy fullness that, dare I say, invited thoughts of the softness that one might experience while kissing them. His nose, while nicely shaped, was slightly small and flat for his face, and his skin, while exhibiting a youthful smoothness, still possessed the telltale creases and bags of a life of earnest work. Mrs. Earl, on the other hand, possessed a head of thick, wavy hair. Although much grayer than that of her husband's, it was about the same length, the ends of which still retained the chestnut-brown color of her youth. Her eyebrows, while not quite as full as her husband's, had a shape that brought a certain dignity to her lush green eyes, which seemed to be deeply assessing of all the minute qualities of anything which fell under her gaze. It is as if she's attempting to uncover the hidden secrets of any subject that her eyes may confront. While very intense, I would describe her gaze as less totally unforgiving than acutely sensitive. Her long, slender nose lends a graceful feminine quality to the rest of her face, which, while not necessarily masculine, doesn't quite exhibit the same fragility and elegance. Her neck, long and slender, stiffly extended from the cowl-style neckline of her dark sack-like dress, which was softened by the presence of simple ribbony details at her waist and shoulder. Her lips, pink and full, lose some of their inviting qualities by the slightly pinched quality of her mouth created by the deep creases at the corners. Mrs. Earl possesses a steely seriousness that reveals the deep strength of her character. I was really hoping that they would be here today so that I could have introduced you to them personally, but they were only here for a short time. Perhaps if you should run into them here sometime in the future, please give them my regards. So people didn't actually see these paintings. They just basically got a description. So the third room that I went into was a room of seascapes and landscapes. And so as I entered this room, I positioned myself in front of the paintings, and I sort of serenaded them with a song from West Side Story called Somewhere. And I would move from painting to painting, kind of singing this song. There's a place for us, somewhere a place for us, peace and quiet and open air, wait for us somewhere. time for us. Someday a time for us. Time together with time to spare. Time to look, time to care. Someday, somewhere, we'll find a new way of living. We'll find a way of forgiving. Somewhere, there's a place for us, a time and a place for us. Hold my hand and we're halfway there. Hold my hand and I'll take you there. Somehow, some way, somewhere. Okay, so after I finished that, I kind of rushed to the next room, which is a room filled with paintings of flowers and sort of post-impressionist portraits of ladies and babies. Very feminine room. So on my rush into there, before everyone had a chance to understand where I was going and follow me, I doused myself in a lot of rose-scented perfume. So as you followed in behind me, what you got was this kind of very intense smell of roses. And I placed myself in front of these two rose paintings, and I read a poem by Gertrude Stein, sort of called Sacred Emily, which is sort of like her most famous line comes from this poem, which is, "A rose is a rose is a rose." And I'm just going to read a little bit of the poem to you. I think the poem itself is sort of about certain ideas about how we identify things and what meanings are, and the slipperiness of language versus how you hear it versus how you see it. And like a rose is a rose is a rose is sort of like about the slipperiness of meaning of what that means, to that word itself means. I'm just going to read a bit of the poem, not the whole poem, it's sort of long. Pepperness, nevertheless extra stress, nevertheless tenderness, old sight, pearls, real line, shoulders, upper states, mere colors, recent resign, search needles, all a plain show, white papers, slippers, slippers underneath, little tell, I chance too, I chance too, I chance too. What is a winter wedding, Furnish seats nicely. Please repeat for, please repeat. This is a name to Anna. Cushions in pairs, reason purses to relay carpets. Marble is thoroughfare, nuts are spittoons. That is a word careless. Paper peaches are tears. Rest in grapes, thoroughly needed signs, all but, relieving. Argonauts, that is plenty. Cunning Saxon symbol of beauty, thimble of everything. Cunning clover thimble, cunning of everything. Cunning of thimble, cunning. Place in pets, night town a glass. Color mahogany center. Rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. Loveliness extreme, extra gators, loveliness extreme, sweetest ice cream. Page ages, wiped, wire, sweeter than peaches and pears and cream. Wiped wire, extra extreme. Put measure treasure, tables track, nursed, dough, that will do. cup, or. I guess I could stop there. But you get the idea. Okay, so that was Here Day Gone Tomorrow. I'm going to talk now about the last show that I had at Canada, which happened in 2016. The show consisted of, this is when you walked into the gallery, consisted of a series of poster collage pieces that are covered in latex rubber, and four figurative sculptures, and sort of, you'll see in this next slide, these sort of things that are hanging are another kind of hanging sculpture. And so that's as you're walking in, and then you reach to the back part of the gallery, where is this sculpture, and then the selection of rubber-coated posters that are in black rubber-coated frames. And then there was this other sculpture that was activated in a performance that happened the night of the opening, and then 3 other times during the run of the show, there was performances. And so the way the show was hung was that the posters were hung cheek by jowl next to each other, very tight, all the way around the room, so you were a bit surrounded by the work. And it sort of had a feel of like maybe a film strip or sort of a sound wave, but there was a sense of time, I guess, in the way it was hung, or that's what I was hoping to do. So the other element that was part of the show was that the show had a soundtrack that lasted, I think it was like 26 days. And so it ran for the whole run of the show. This soundtrack played quite quietly, at a reasonable level. And it consisted of songs that you would hear like at a Duane Reade or the laundromat or in the background of a restaurant, sort of popular music from all different eras, but none of the songs ever repeated. So every song was sort of, you didn't hear the same songs again and again. You heard for the whole run of the show, the soundtrack never repeated, and they were all different songs. So this is a piece, I'm gonna probably go through these fast because I don't know where we are in time-wise. We're getting a little. But this is a piece called Triple Doors. And so each of these images will have some sound to them. So these are, the front room had 2 of these shaped pieces. The other rooms, everything was kind of based on the rectangle. And there was different, materials that are collaged on it, which was sort of like detritus, some stuff that kind of floated into my life. I didn't really go seek out any of these things. The thing about the posters, actually, they're also found. When I first moved to New York, as I was moving into my apartment, I had found somebody was throwing away a bunch of posters. Some of these pieces are quite big, actually, too. But they were throwing away these posters, and I brought them with me thinking I would do something with them one day, but didn't really kind of use them again for another 15 years. So they kind of just sat at my house, and they got very deteriorated, because my place leaked. It was kind of shabby kind of place. And I found them in my apartment, and I was like, oh, these kind of got messed up. You can see the stains in this one. And I was like, oh, what can I do with these? And I had started working with latex rubber, and I kind of put them over the poster as a way to as sort of this failed way of preserving the poster, because latex is very, it's not a stable kind of thing. It sort of gets dried out and rots, but in a way it protects them from, it protects this stuff and seals it inside to this, encapsulates the poster, and in a way protects it. This piece is double T-Rex. This is double Led Zeppelin. Now, like some of the materials in there are sort of like postcards from people's shows, a lot of like wrappers from candy, six-pack rings, beads, ribbons, old photographs, advertisements that you might get in the mail, notes people left me. This is an old L7 poster, and so you can see there's a collar of a shirt that I cut the collar off of. Sort of stuff that normally you would throw away sort of made their way into all these kind of collage pieces. This is Triple New Order, and this piece could really go either this way or upside down the other way. A lot of them could function that way. There's sort of no top, no bottom. They're sort of... And so this has some like old Valentines people had given me, and some stickers, and postcards, some packagings from clothes. This piece called Concrete Blonde, and it has bits of freeze pop wrappers and postcards from when my band played at CBGB's. Christmas garland. This is Heaven or Las Vegas. This is a diptych. The way this piece was put together, I kind of made both of the posters at the same time next to each other, responding from one to the other. So you'll see there's things that sort of match between the posters and some things that don't. These are relatively large pieces. They're sort of around 5 foot by 3 foot-ish. Other pieces are smaller. This piece is called Godzilla. And so it has keys in it. It has paint swatches, some ads from the back of the Village Voice, some photographs, some zippers. This one's small. This is sort of some yoga places poster for their yoga classes. That's plays on that kind of "Hey Girl" meme that was popular for a mile, a little bit there. Okay, and this one's kind of interesting, mainly because it has some like personal letters that people had sent me that I incorporated into the piece. There's often some food things. I tend to use food a lot in the work directly attached to the piece. I think we'll get to one. Like, okay, so this is a double Bowie, but sort of like some of the string is sort of string or yarn, but some of the stringy looking stuff is actually linguine. And, there's lottery tickets. And so let's see if we can move on. So this is a fairly small one. Some of the posters were posters that were at my parents' house from when me and my brothers were younger, that still were there. Some of the posters were taken off the street in my neighborhood. This one's a fairly large piece. This one's probably about like 7 foot by 3 foot, 8 foot by 3 foot. Let me get to... This is an Elvis Costello poster. Okay, this one it's for this movie Get Hard, but it has sort of like these goopy looking black parts are licorice. The kind of little golden bits are beer flavored jelly beans. Oh, and This is a piece called Vim Vigor, and if, it actually uses a postcard of a show that Lizzie Scott did with Josh Blackwell. Some of you may know Lizzie. She's sitting right over there. Also a rubber finger. Joy Division atmosphere. Now this is a little bit of an earlier example of the posters. These are the more collaged ones, or the newer ones. Earlier I would make the posters with the rubber, but usually it would just be one element. It wouldn't be so collaged. So this one's just basically like cheesecloth and like powder over, covered with rubber. So the early pieces are a little more like taking one sort of object and placing on top in a kind of direct relationship, not so much layers of information. Okay, I'm just gonna skip a little bit ahead here. Okay, so there was a performance aspect to this show, and the performance was called Narcissus. And basically, what happened in the performance is that I laid on a massage table in the gallery, and then on the back of my face down, staring into a bucket that was spray painted black in the middle that was filled with water. And I would lay with my face inside the cushion, and on the back of my head was this Michael Jackson mask. So it was a 3-hour performance the night of the opening where I pretty much laid very still and contemplated myself for 3 hours while everyone kind of it came around. So this performance happened 4 times over the run of the exhibition. 2 of the other times I had other people come and present sort of work. One person presented a lecture about George Romero and Dawn of the Dead and zombies as related to a king of Spain. And so he did that. It was probably like an hour and a half, and I laid on the massage table, perusing my own reflection in the bucket of water. And then the second event, the third event after the opening was I invited some authors to come in and read excerpts of their books, which was sort of about 2 hours, and I was just laid very still and looked at myself. And then for the final performance, it was a kind of a quasi-ritual that was going to raise this sort of dead Michael Jackson figure from Michael Jackson / Narcissus, to raise him from the dead, I guess, you know. And so it started out, somebody wrote with salt on the floor, a large letter A, and then followed by 2 words, so rose, and then underneath rose it said lone. So the big A in front of it made one seem like a rose, and then alone. And then again, I had someone read Sacred Emily, the Gertrude Stein poem, while I pretty much stayed still. The second portion of the performance that occurred, I had handed out a bunch of harmonicas at one point, and everyone kind of played the harmonicas. And as they were playing the harmonicas, 3 people wearing emergency blankets, wearing roller skates, carrying incense sticks, roller skated around the space while a drummer improvised, and a video projection of fire. I know this video is not very good. Fire was projected in the space. And as that went on, somebody else came in dressed as the devil and was handing out chocolate coins to people. And from above, there was a fan that was blowing out fake money over the crowd. And then you'll see at the bottom, eventually Michael
me, Narcissus Michael, eventually it rises from the massage table. Might take a second here. Oh, there also was a fog machine. You can't really tell in the video so much in the beginning, so we tried to fill the room with a bit of fog. But you see, then I rise from the table, and then I take the bucket of water I was staring in and wash away the text. Eventually, what comes on is Michael Jackson's song, "You Are Not Alone," which I sing from behind the mask. And then as this is happening from above, they're blowing fake snow out of a window from above. All right, so you get the idea. I'm going to stop now because I've gone pretty far over probably where I was supposed to.
Yeah, I'm responding in a formal way in terms of how I'm putting things together, and then sometimes you have sort of like nice things start to come together. It's a little bit chance plays a lot in it. So like when I'm making something like the posters, I have these boxes of sort of ephemera that kind of accumulate. And I'm sure you have stuff that accumulates in your house too, like that. And so as I'm putting the poster together, I'm kind of going through the boxes. And suddenly something will be like, oh, these two things kind of speak to each other. Now, I'm not trying to have a very distinct meaning. There's sort of this space where you can kind of read it, but that's sort of not I'm not trying to give you a very directed kind of meaning. You may see it. There's like little jokes embedded in a lot of them. Like there's like formal jokes, and then there's sort of inside jokes. Often I'll use like fortune cookie fortunes, which some of them end up being really kind of funny within the work. Like, you don't know what you can do unless you do it, or something like that, sort of. And so, or I might be, eating a particular, like a lot of food gets in there. So if I'm eating some kind of candy, like, oh, I'm just going to put these licorice pieces into the work, but then, the work happens to have something that like, relates to the color black or something like that. And then so there's like kind of little games that are going, but it's sort of, there's not some direct message I'm kind of getting across in them. But they are very formally considered, sort of. I'm working with the image, especially on the collage pieces, working with the image that's already there and responding to that. So every addition is sort of a response to the last move that I made. Well, I think I've always feel like, having a show is such a blessing or some kind of generous thing already. And if I have the space in order to open it up to other people I know to have an opportunity to present stuff. Like one of the first shows I did at Canada was a show called Insides, but I had a performance element to it called Presence, and it was for the whole run of the show. Every day there was different performances by different artists, and then my final performance for that show was to bring everybody back for the last show and kind of choreograph all of the performances at once in one evening. And so I try to take advantage of the fact that I have this space to use, and how can I open that up for my peers to be able to access the space also, and get the most bang for the buck, I guess. And because there's a lot more spaces now than there used to be, but sort of making space for other work, for a community to around my work, around who I'm interested in and what I think is interesting. It seems like an opportunity to be inclusive, I guess. No, I had made the sculptures previously in the studio, so I knew it was scripted. Like I knew what they were going to be at the end. So basically, I brought the pieces into the gallery, and then I assembled them the way I wanted them to be at the end, and then I disassembled them and spread them throughout the gallery. So then I knew like what they were going to turn into. Yeah. Well, I kind of ended up in the doing work in the dance world sort of by accident. And what had happened is I've always had music projects, and a choreographer asked me to do some music for their piece, and from there, they were like, oh, they found that I did performance also, and they recommended that I apply to do a performance at Judson Church as part of movement research, which movement research is sort of a present work by choreographers at Judson Church. Now, I don't know if you know about Judson Church or the history of Judson Church and kind of downtown dance in New York, but if not, you should go to MoMA. Right now is an amazing show. And there's a lot of connections between the art world and the early Judson Church thing. So I wasn't really very aware of that, but I kind of accidentally fell into that and have since made a lot of performance work. I don't necessarily, if I would consider myself a choreographer, but a lot of my own personal work has a lot to do with arranging things, which, a lot of choreography has to do with arranging all these kind of moving parts. So it's very similar to my more traditional sculpture work. And then, so I've made pieces within that realm that kind of talk to ideas that kind of were developed early in the early kind of Judson Church movement in downtown dance in the 60s. Now, since being involved in there, I've met a lot of dancers, and now I work very often with this choreographer named Luciana achugar. And the way I started with her is that she had seen some of my sculptures, and she wanted to use them within one of her dances. And then as we were talking, and we developed this sort of very conversational relationship about talking about ideas. And then I moved from doing these prompts for her to doing music for her. And then she would be like, "Oh, I'd like you to do music for this other performance." And then I would say, "Well, I don't, thinking about the conceptual ideas behind your work, I don't think it needs." I talked myself out of gigs basically with her, till eventually I ended up performing in her works as a dancer. So it became this sort of accidental entry into being into working with dance, and it informs greatly how I approach performance in a way that I probably hadn't approached it prior to that. Well, yeah. I'm interested in sort of like ideas of things not being very stable. So like the sculptures aren't glued together or held together; they're just sort of arranged. And then using some things like the latex rubber, which is very kind of an unstable thing that is going to change throughout time. It's not very stable, and so my idea is that you kind of the work kind of forces you to always be in the present moment, like your relationship right now with the work, because later that's going to change. So the use of some things like music, that never repeats. It always plays the same. It's always different. So it starts to talk a little bit about subjectivity and sort of how we're always in a constant state of flux. So I want the works to feel a little bit like they're always in a constant state of flux, it's maybe a little dark, but it's sort of, my work tends to deal in ideas about like death, eventually, this doesn't last forever. It's like you're present in the moment. So it becomes a little bit timeless, like you can only experience it. And then sort of like using things like smells and things like that also kind of put you directly in the moment that you're experiencing, but also kind of something like music kind of creates a little rift, because then you hear a song and you're like, oh, I remember that song from when I was 6 years old. So it sort of like disrupts it makes you aware of time as you're experiencing it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Last question? Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Michael.